welcome. I'm Suma Katauka and you're watching World Report on News 6 World. Let's take a look at the top headlines of this hour. China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi has expressed hope that the United States would meet China halfway to prepare for high-level interactions between the two nations. During a phone call with U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Wang has emphasized the importance of the long-standing relationship between Presidents Xi Jinping and Donald Trump, calling it a valuable strategic asset. Russian President Vladimir Putin has stated that Russia's relations with North Korea are progressing as planned during a meeting with North Korean Foreign Minister Choi Son-hui at the Kremlin. A video posted on the Kremlin's Telegram account showed Putin greeting Choi with a handshake, expressing confidence in the bilateral ties. Hurricane Melissa has intensified into a Category 5 storm heading towards Jamaica and the Caribbean, with officials warning of catastrophic flooding. The storm has already claimed at least 4 lives in the Haiti and the Dominican Republic, where heavy rains and landslides have caused widespread destruction. The UN calls for an immediate ceasefire in Al-Fashar, Sudan, warning that civilians are cut off from food, healthcare, and safe escape routes as fighting intensifies. Aid agencies say targeted attacks on hospitals and humanitarian workers are deepening the crisis. A U.S. Navy Seahawk helicopter and an F/A-18F Super Hornet fighter jet has crashed separately into the South China Sea yesterday during routine operations from the USS Nimitz. The incidents occurred amid President Donald Trump's Asia tour, while China has offered humanitarian aid, and both crashes remain under investigation now. Argentina's peso has surged 10% to 1,355 per US dollar after President Javier Milei's party secured a landslide midterm election victory. While U.S. President Donald Trump has claimed Washington gave a lot of help, including $40 billion bailout package to support Milei ahead of the vote. European Council President Antonio Costa has said high-level Chinese officials will visit Brussels in the coming weeks to discuss Beijing's export curbs on rare earths, which have sparked global shortages and escalated trade tensions. Israeli Foreign Minister Gideon Sa'ar has said that Israel will not accept Turkish armed forces in Gaza under U.S. President Donald Trump's plan for a permanent ceasefire. Sa'ar has stated that only countries Israel is comfortable with should join the proposed multinational force. Now we move on to our first news. A Chinese delegation will visit Brussels on Thursday for talks with the European Union over Beijing's new export curbs on rare earths, vital materials for the auto, electronics, and defense industries. This is what Antonio Costa, European Council President, has said.
As you know, we are very concerned about the trade relationship with China, and especially the recent measures that China adopt to export control of critical raw materials. And the high-level delegation from China is going to Brussels in the coming weeks, and we hope to address this in the proper. Also with China, we want to have a good trade relations, but in fact, we have some problems that we raise and we need to address, and China knows very well what kind of problems we are facing and what China needs to do to overcome this situation.
Meanwhile, EU leaders, including Ursula von der Leyen, has urged Beijing to act as a responsible partner and lift barriers that threaten trade stability. China's Prime Minister Li Qiang, on the other hand, has signaled readiness for dialogue, saying Beijing is open to resolving economic issues and boosting cooperation in green and digital sectors. The EU is also accelerating efforts to reduce dependence on Chinese rare earths by recycling and forming new partnerships with countries such as Canada, Australia, and Ukraine. Now for this discussion, we welcome Raymond Vickery. He's a former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Commerce, joins us live from Washington, D.C. Thank you very much, Raymond, for joining us again. Good to see you. Now, looking at this with growing concerns in Europe over trade imbalances and security with China, can they rebuild trust with each other, or are they entering a new era of economic decoupling?
Well, thanks very much for having me. You know, peace and prosperity must be waged just like war. That means you have to have a strategy and you must have partners. What has happened, particularly since the rise of the Trump administration in the United States, is to throw out the multilateral system, which has served the world very well since World War II, a multilateral system in which there is consensus building and there are international rules in terms of trade, in terms of tariffs, in terms of embargoes, restrictions on exports, and so forth. All of that has been thrown out of the window in favor of a bilateral transactional approach, which President Trump exemplifies. And the latest disputes over rare earth, of course, are a part of the ongoing bilateral dispute between the United States and China. Europe gets caught in the crosshairs because the export regulations which China's imposed, even though they are aimed specifically at the United States, affect Europe as well. So in this new era in which we are trying to maintain stability both economically and strategically, Europe has to be able to negotiate on a bilateral basis with China, just as each other nation in the world has to do that. And I would emphasize that economic and strategic matters are joined at the hip. It is not the case that you can consider economic matters separately from the strategic and military. In fact, as has been shown in the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the whole sanctions question there, these two considerations, economic and security, are very much related. It is to be hoped that the EU will be able to take a leadership program forward with the Chinese. There is also hope that in the upcoming discussions on Thursday between Xi and President Trump, that there will be some return to principles in terms of international trade rather than just might makes right. If I have the ability to restrict something which somebody else needs, if I have the ability to exclude people from my market, then my might will make right. That is not the way forward for the world. And it is a very, very disconcerting development, which is exemplified most recently in the tussle over rare earths and more broadly the bilateral tariffs which President Trump has tried to impose on the rest of the world.
Yes, indeed. And also looking at China, bringing China to this discussion, Raymond, how do you think, to what extent do China's rare earth policies reflect its own geopolitical leverage versus domestic economic priorities?
Well, it is at this point totally in the international leverage field. There are people in the United States who are decrying China's resort to restrictions on rare earth as blackmail. Well, why should one be amazed or surprised that if you threaten 100% tariffs, as President Trump has on China, that they don't look around for an economic weapon to be able to try to counteract that. And that is what has happened. Now, I think originally China developed its rare earth industry not as an international tool, but because it wanted to be a leader in the technologies of the future, whether that be electrical vehicles, whether it be renewable power. All of these things required rare earth. The United States and Europe were asleep at the switch, really, in regard to rare earths, and are now just waking up to the fact that you can't not depend, if you have a strategic competition with China, on China for a critical mineral for going forward in technology, in computer chips, electrical vehicles, as I say, a whole range of technologies which require these inputs.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, Raymond, for sharing that insight. Please stay with us as we come back to you. Now we move on. Hungary's Foreign Minister Petro Szijjártó has announced that Prime Minister Viktor Orban will discuss Russian energy and U.S. sanctions with U.S. President Donald Trump in Washington next week. He has also stated that initial stage discussions had already taken place between the Hungarian Prime Minister and U.S. officials earlier regarding energy supply issues. Let's listen in.
Kérdés. Ami a mi energiállátásunkat illeti, nem vagyok híve semmifajta üzengetésnek. Ezt a kérdést én személyesen többször végigbeszéltem Marco Rubioval, a miniszterelnök végigbeszélte az amerikai elnökkel. Lesz lehetőség a jövő hét második felében Washingtonban arra, hogy ezt a kérdést a miniszterelnök személyesen beszélje végig az amerikai elnökkel.
The Hungarian foreign minister has further stressed that there would be a chance next week for the Hungarian Prime Minister to address oil supply issues personally with U.S. President Donald Trump, particularly on sanctions affecting Russian oil companies. Now, this comes as U.S. President Donald Trump imposed sanctions on Russia's two largest oil companies, targeting Lukoil and Rosneft, which he claimed was a direct effort to pressure Russia into halting its frontline assaults on Ukraine. Additionally, Hungary is working on ways to circumvent these sanctions without violating them, with Hungarian Prime Minister Orban actively engaging in talks with local energy companies. Now we move on to Central Latin America. Argentina's President Javier Milei has scored a major political and market victory after his party won over 40% in Sunday's midterm elections, strengthening his mandate for sweeping economic reforms. Financial markets have reacted with enthusiasm. The Merval index surged more than 20%. Major stocks jumped over 30%, and bond yields dropped sharply, easing borrowing costs. The peso also strengthened against the dollar and investors' confidence surged. U.S. President Donald Trump has congratulated Milei on the big win, crediting his administration's support and his personal endorsement for helping secure the victory. Calling Milei a wonderful Trump-endorsed candidate, Trump has praised Argentina's leader for pursuing bold free market reforms backed by Washington. Now, for this discussion, we're joined by Raymond Vickery. He's a former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Commerce, joins us live from Washington, D.C. Thank you very much, Raymond, for staying with us. Now, looking at this, how did the U.S.'s involvement and endorsement in Argentina's domestic politics, does this reflect undue interference in another nation's democratic process, or is this okay from U.S. citizens' perspective, as U.S. government is still under shutdown?
Well, it seems to me that it is an example of the duality of the Trump approach to international affairs and international economic affairs. He has destroyed the U.S. Agency for International Development, which provided some funds to the poorest nations, people in need around the world. And yet he found $40 billion to give to his cohort that he is supporting in Argentina. In other words, you can use taxpayer dollars to support your friends, and quite frankly, the financiers, and many of whom are billionaires, who are very heavily invested in loans to Argentina. And so President Trump has bailed out Argentina while he's let the poorest of the poor off with no support from the United States at all. This is completely contrary to the way in which the United States has conducted itself in the past, but is very much a part of President Trump's view that he is entitled to interfere in elections around the world so long as those who are at stake support his approach to international affairs, and indeed to what we have in the United States as First Amendment rights, and that is a concern for the individual, freedoms of speech, freedoms of thought, and so forth. Those have been trampled to some extent in Argentina, and yet because he has, the Argentine Prime Minister has supported Trump, he's taken that approach. It didn't work in Brazil, where he supported Bolsonaro and made all kinds of threats against the government of Brazil. It at this point seems to be working in Argentina, but again, it will not work in the long run, because there has to be a strategy. There has to be some adherence to rule of law, to principles, as opposed to what is a transactional approach of President Trump. And that's it. What's in it for me on this particular transaction, rather than what is needed for a relationship which builds prosperity in the long run. So this is a seeming victory for President Trump, but there have been no policy changes in Argentina which will solve the basic kinds of problems in terms of the fiscal responsibility necessary to build prosperity in that country.
And Raymond, how might Argentina's sweeping economic reforms under this President Milei impact bilateral trade and investment opportunities with other countries, and what lessons can other economies draw from Argentina's market reaction to Milei's pro-market policies?
Well,
there seemed to have a technical problem with our guest, but thank you very much, Raymond, for joining us and sharing that insight throughout our news as a former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Commerce. Now we move on to Middle East. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has stated that Washington does not see Israel's Saturday strike on Gaza as a violation of the U.S. brokered ceasefire with Hamas. The strike targeted a Palestinian Islamic Jihad operative whom Israel said was planning an imminent attack. Palestinian media reported one person was killed and others injured in the strike. Rubio has spoke aboard U.S. President Donald Trump's plane during his Asia tour. He has emphasized that Israel retains the right to self-defense under the ceasefire. He further stated that Israel has the right if there is an imminent threat to them. Rubio also called on Hamas to speed up the return of dead hostages remains. Israel maintains such actions are permitted under the truce, though Hamas calls them violations. Now for this discussion, we welcome Jordan Cope. He's a Middle East expert, joins us live from Dallas. Thank you very much, Jordan, for joining us again. Good to see you. Jordan, does Washington's refusal to condemn Israel's strike on Gaza reveal a double standard in how U.S. applies international law and ceasefire agreements, or is the U.S. prioritizing its political alliance with Israel?
I think the outlook is skewed. In fact, Israel and the United States, before conducting airstrikes, refer to their legal counsels to ensure that such airstrikes are within the realm of the laws of armed conflict. And certainly in this case, it does appear that the Islamic Jihad official who was targeted was in fact in the final preparation stages of launching an attack. And these attacks shouldn't be dismissed. One must remember that 2 Israeli soldiers were already killed in trying to preserve the ceasefire that is currently in place and its conditions. And Israel still has tried to maintain the conditions of the ceasefire, even though Hamas has violated the Trump peace plan on multiple occasions and in material ways, whether it be through withholding hostages that should have been returned in a timely manner, which Hamas and other factions in the Gaza Strip have failed to conform with, and or other conditions along the way. And it should be noted that the Trump peace plan, ultimately, the parties who are suspect and who are binded to the peace deal do not actually include the Islamic Jihad, but rather Israel and Hamas. Israel should not have to forfeit its right to self-defense, especially in terms of preserving this peace deal, which leaves Israeli soldiers often as sitting ducks and very vulnerable, knowing that they're dealing with irrational actors who have no respect for international law.
And going back to bringing U.S. into this, is U.S. prioritizing its political alliance with Israel over its responsibility to act as a mediator or impartial mediator in between Hamas and Israel?
I think the assessment which the question poses is off. Israel and the United States do have differences when it comes to this peace deal. There are many in Israel who disagree with many aspects of this deal, and many in Israel do eventually wish to deal with the threat that is Hamas in the Gaza Strip. And even though the United States at times has made clear that if Hamas doesn't follow through with the implementation of the peace deal, that Israel will have a right to return and ensure that Hamas is disarmed, a material condition that Hamas has made clear that it refuses to comply with. The United States, though, and Israel, in essence, ultimately do have disagreements in terms of how they will see this deal ultimately implemented and enforced. And so to suggest that the United States ultimately has some political agenda that is so pro-Israel, while the United States, behind the scenes, seemingly has been trying to restrain Israel in its right at this point, given Hamas's violation of the deal, to respond with appropriate force to the Hamas threat, it is a skewed assessment, in my opinion.
Thank you very much, Jordan, for sharing that insight. Please stay with us as we stay on this topic now. Israel has stated that it had allowed a team, including Red Cross staff, Egyptian rescuers, and a Hamas member to search for the bodies of the deceased hostages in Gaza. The Israeli government has stated that the teams have been permitted to search beyond the yellow line in the area controlled by the Israel Defense Forces in Gaza. Shosh Bedroujan has reacted to the situation. Let's listen in.
Red Cross, the Egyptian technical team, and a Hamas person have also been permitted to enter beyond the IDF's yellow line position in Gaza under close IDF supervision to identify the location of our hostages.
Earlier, Hamas has transferred 15 out of 28 deceased Israeli hostages under the first phase of U.S.-brokered ceasefire deal, which requires it to hand over all hostage bodies. The U.S. President Donald Trump has warned Hamas to start returning the bodies quickly, or the other countries involved in this great peace will take action. Now for this discussion, we go back to Jordan Cope. He's a Middle East expert, joins us live from Dallas. Thank you very much, Jordan, for staying with us. Now,
Thank you.
Thank you. Now, looking at this, can you say that Israeli hostages' bodies have not returned yet, but the phase 2 discussions are on way? What is your analysis over this current situation of phase 1 and moving to phase 2?
It's very possible we will not see a phase 2 in terms of the implementation, given Hamas's material breaches of Trump's peace plan. Ultimately, one of the foremost material conditions is that which provides Hamas's disarmament and removal from the Gaza Strip. Hamas has made very clear that it has no intention to disarm or to leave the Gaza Strip in the long term. And Donald Trump has had to make threat time and time again that if Hamas does not follow through with the implementation and enforcement of the peace deal, the United States might actually have to, and I quote, kill Hamas members in the Gaza Strip, whatever that actually means. Now, when it comes to the 13 deceased hostages that remain in the Gaza Strip, Israel supposedly knows where 9 of them exist, which means that Hamas surely knows that at least 9, and most likely all 13 deceased corpses, Hamas likely knows where they all exist. And the fact that Hamas continues to drag this out is ultimately a gesture on its part to show that it is still in control of the Gaza Strip, that it has no intention of leaving, and that has no intention of fully abiding by the peace plan, including the material condition that it disarm and leave the Gaza Strip. And so Hamas also has tried to push the boundaries, literally, arguing that it needs to be beyond the yellow line in the Gaza Strip to retrieve the bodies where it supposedly believes they are located. Now, there is a chance that some of the bodies might be located beyond the ceasefire line. However, more likely, it is an effort by Hamas to extend its presence beyond the agreed-upon ceasefire lines currently in place. And on top of all of this, Hamas is now asking for heavy-duty equipment to supposedly be able to retrieve the bodies. In essence, Hamas is making very clear that it doesn't plan on disarming, but it does want the necessary construction and engineering materials to rebuild the Gaza Strip before it plans on actually abiding by any of the conditions of the ceasefire.
But Jordan, don't you think they need to move the rubbles off of the deceased bodies? Isn't that why Hamas is needing of those bulldozers or excavators?
It's possibly the case, but based on the totality of the circumstances, Hamas's refusal to conform and comply with the foremost material conditions of the Trump's peace plan, it's very unlikely that that Hamas, a completely irrational actor with no regard for agreements or international law, reminding you that they violated ceasefire agreements for time immemorial, not just during this war, but in wars past. Hamas has no intention of leaving the Gaza Strip. It has no intention of surrendering power, and it's using every opportunity it can, as I once said earlier, to literally push the boundaries, to restore its presence all throughout the Gaza Strip, and perhaps even to prepare itself for future war with Israel. So one must remain very skeptical. And it is true that some bodies might be located under rubble, and the Red Cross is currently working with Hamas to locate the remains of the 13 deceased hostages. But what that effect also has, in a way, is legitimizing Hamas's presence and rule in the Gaza Strip by demonstrating a presence of a somewhat respected international institution working with Hamas, even though it has deservedly lost much respect throughout this war for its refusal to engage with the hostages in the Gaza Strip and their families as sufficiently necessary.
With that, I would like to thank Jordan Cope for joining us and sharing that insight as a Middle East expert from Dallas. Thank you very much. Now we move on to Africa. Armed men opened fire on protesters outside the home of Cameroonian opposition leader Issa Chiroma Bakary in Garoua. The violence came after President Paul Biya was declared the winner of the October 12th election. Chiroma rejected the results and has said that 2 people were killed in the shooting. Though it is unclear who fired the shots, protesters have clashed repeatedly with security forces over the past week. Biya, who is 92 years old, secured an 8th term with 53.66% of the vote. Opposition supporters and security forces remain on high alert across the country. Let's listen in to some of the protesters.
Le peuple camerounais, la jeunesse camerounaise réclame sa victoire en majorité. On sait tous que le Cameroun, le peuple, ont voté en majorité pour Issa Thiroum Bakary. Il est inadmissible qu'on retrouve que le président Paul Biya a gagné dans certaines zones en guerre.
Le Cameroun a une très bonne image à l'extérieur. Je ne comprends pas pourquoi est-ce qu'une personne va prendre le pouvoir et s'accaparer de ça comme si c'était pour sa famille. Le Cameroun, ce n'est pas un royaume. Le Cameroun, c'est un pays béni, un très beau pays, un pays respecté par tous et de tous. Alors on se doit de préserver l'image du Cameroun, quel que soit le prix que cela doit nous coûter.
That's all we have time for. Keep watching News 6 World for more news updates from around the world.